Welcome to How to Prepare Multiple Choice Test Items. I wanted to, I always forget to introduce myself. I'm Christy Kittle from Academic Outreach and Innovation, who's putting on this series with the help of our faculty volunteers. I want to give a shout out to our media team. They're the ones streaming this video for all of you out in a distance. We're going to start by introducing ourselves at some point. If you are online, feel free to introduce yourself and participate that way. We have someone monitoring that chat, so you can participate just like you were here with us. And without further ado, I will introduce Phil Mixter, and he is School of Molecular Biosciences and College of Veterinary Medicine. I think he'll do the better job of introducing himself and how great he is.
Thank you, Christy. Great to be here today, and welcome all our folks on the stream. Really my pleasure to tackle something that's an issue with a lot of instructors, proper best practices in constructing multiple choice items, as well as some work on reflecting. So my hope is that this will be an interactive session. We've got a few people here in Pullman, and we've got some other folks online. And if you do have questions or comments, I really encourage you to throw those into the comment section on the stream. There'll be a bit of a delay, but we'll try and get those questions to the floor and get the topics you want to talk about out in front of us. So what we're going to do today is start in sort of a two-part thrust. My hope is to give some content, talk about some best practices, and really get into the weeds, into the nuts and bolts in the first session, talk about the ideal and our goals, and again, convey some of those best practices. We want to make sure you know that there are some great resources available to you. I am not a multiple choice expert, but I have some experience, I have some miles, and in that regard, I'm going to join you in a community of practitioners who are all trying to improve in this practice. We'll take a short break for folks here, or depending on the time, maybe we'll just keep going. But my real hope would be that we'd actually get some editing done. We'd have you revise your questions. We'd have those questions that you've already written maybe, or questions you want to write about a difficult topic, and you'd use these new practices to better inform how you go about this. And as you'll see, getting some feedback from colleagues is really an essential part. So socializing this process, we don't want you to do this alone in your office at midnight on the night before the test. We want you to get out in front of this, ideally, and have a test that you can circulate with your colleagues, with people you trust, to proofread it, and to get a sense of some of the things you're doing you may or may not be aware of that are giving students insights into how to work the test and take away from the ability of those test items to really discriminate their knowledge, which is kind of the whole point. So that's where we're headed, and again, if you're just walking in online or you're on your way in Pullman, I hope you'll join us as you're able. So I like to think that this talk might have a different kind of answer, or title rather, excuse me, if this was your sort of test question. You might say, well, what's the answer to this test question, right? Should I A, employ evidence-based best practices? B, write all my questions in one sitting? I'm sorry, don't write all my questions in one sitting. C, make incorrect answers, known as distractors, plausible alternatives. D, randomize the correct answers to avoid patterns that your students can recognize. E, all of the A, B, C, and D above are correct. And bolded, maybe I gave away the punchline, E is actually the correct answer. Those are all great practices. The exception that's a good practice here is you should never use all of the above as a construct. So I violated my own principles to show you that even the most well-intended attempts at humor come violating those principles. I wonder if we could would now be a good time to spend some time introducing people around the room. I don't know if there's a crowd online who'd be willing to do that as well, or how are we doing? Are we a little early on that, you think? Okay, all right, fair enough. My name is Phil, and again, I hope you'll use that. Want to start over here?
My name is Amina Barnes-Cannon. I'm with AOI.
My name is Mary Packer, and I'm with AOI as well.
I'm Christy Kittle, and I teach at Teach and Learn class.
I'm Rebecca Vandevoort, and I direct the Learning Innovations team for AOI. I'm Assistant Vice President, and I also teach a teaching and learning class, grad level class. And I think I am really weak at writing test questions, which is why I am here.
Excellent. Okay. Well, again, if you're watching this as a live stream, I hope you'll chip in whenever you want to. And we'll start with some of those best practices and really talk about how we can improve those. I want to point you in the direction of some very expansive resources, in addition to some quick, a few good pointer kind of resources. And finally, I want to emphasize this idea of socializing the process, making sure you involve your trusted colleagues or friends, or in some cases, partners who are willing to proofread. And then hopefully by the end, we'll have a chance to write some questions together. And for those of you who are actually teaching classes, I'm going to count on you to bring some material along. So I thought we'd model some interactive and social behaviors here by asking the question about what are the barriers, what are the things that get in the way of writing effective multiple choice questions. And again, if this is something you're new to, you may not recognize what those barriers are. But if you would, find a neighbor, or if you're streaming online, shoot us a comment online that we can repeat for the stream, and answer that question with your neighbor. What are some of the things that get in the way of writing multiple choice questions? And I'll give you, I'll set my nerd watch for 1 minute, and we'll take it from there. Okay, so let's go ahead and reconvene, come back together, and I'll go take my position for the camera. But we had some good discussions, brief discussions here in Pullman, and then I'll ask our assistant Theron over there to help give me the information from the online stream. So one of, I don't know if you want to repeat yourself or I can summarize. One of the common challenges was creating those plausible distractors. The appropriate incorrect answer that isn't so incorrect that it's not the Sesame Street, one of these is not like the other, and gives away some of the answer by being so blatantly wrong. So we can talk a little bit more about that. Those are barriers you know, and my response just briefly in terms of plausible distractors is you may know in your area of expertise where some of the student misconceptions are, where the decision forks go wrong as opposed to right. And so if you think about solving a math problem, but forgetting to include a constant or something like that, then you'll find if you watch students solve similar problems that you can put up that plausible distractor knowing some of the patterns of error in other ways. In other disciplines, if your learning goals are associated with, say, discriminating, telling the difference between art of a certain period and a separate period, or using that period, then you can use some examples, thinking graphically or in image terms, from those periods that are different. But if the goal is for students to have the ability to discriminate those things, you can move forward in that sort of way. Go ahead, Darren, from the online ethos.
We have Lori Wallen-Nelson from Tri-Cities campus. She teaches biology there. She says that time is a huge barrier for her in writing multiple choice questions, that she imagines it is her most important.
Right, so being efficient at writing these questions, I think, comes with some practice, but also we will probably give you some tips in terms of if you struggle with those plausible distractors, then writing the stem and the correct answer can come quickly, but in other cases, they're going to be more challenging as you try and discover reasonable alternatives for students to consider, and those that are good at drawing out where they're making their conceptual errors. Because ultimately, we're using multiple choice largely to test a large group of students and use this sort of approach. Ideally, we'd love to have a conversation with every student and have them think out loud and understand their conceptual frameworks. But that just isn't plausible in a large class or in an asynchronous format or something like that. So we use multiple choice as an accepted format for that sort of approach to test and discriminate our students for their understanding. Is that consistent with what you thought? And I hope I summarized some of your comments well there. Anybody have anything they want to add before we move on? All right. And Theron, we're okay online? All right. So I want to, at the beginning, remind you that I'm going to repeat some best practices that I've found and employ regularly. A couple of great resources. I believe WSU has a site license for Faculty Focus, facultyfocus.com. And Mary Ellen Weimer is an editor there, a person who brings the instructor's perspective to this craft of dealing with multiple choice test items. And she's written two short, sort of two-page articles, if you want to call them that summarize a lot of best practices and also bring in a lot of evidence-based work. The first one are the tips for writing good multiple choice questions. So I'm going to repeat some of those today. The second one is about reflecting on your assessment after you've administered your exam, and really some basics on how to look at multiple choice questions statistically to help you understand their validity in discriminating your students. So, a question online.
Well, not question, actually just a comment. Just for reference, for those of you who are watching either in Pullman or online, on our li.wsu.edu/streaming site, there's a link to this presentation, and all the links are embedded. So I know people are feverishly, taking notes, but I want to let you know the links are there, so y'all can access them.
Right. If you're watching this weeks from now, just press pause, and you can find those links at the LI Learning Innovations website. So thank you, Christy, appreciate that. So in these particular cases, there are some other deeper resources, and around the country there are a number of centers for teaching and learning, or teaching academies, or other sorts of resources on various campuses. One of the most in-depth, sort of the Bible of multiple choice sort of thing, a thicker 75-page document, and again, this is a PDF you can download, comes from Brigham Young University's BYU University, has a resource associated with their testing center. So this campus uses an integrated testing center to administer tests, to process tests, and to help faculty understand how to reflect upon them. So that is a wonderfully deep resource that I recommend to you if this is something you want to wade into. If you're a little less interested in 75 pages of multiple choice best practices, then the quick one-off also from this testing center at BYU is the compendium, right? The Cliff's Notes version of the Bible, which is just 14 rules, the top ways to think differently about writing multiple choice questions. And I'll give you the highlight reel here. Some of the things that I really struggle to remind myself to use is that the statistics show that using a complete question is better than using an incomplete statement. So again, in this example, you'd want to write a stem of a multiple choice question with some punctuation at the end. It should have a period, it should have a question mark, but that question format is much better than an open statement. The open statements are much more open to interpretation by the students, and therefore much more open to misinterpretation by the students. If you were writing, you could imagine inflecting something. The best rule for this practice is, there's all sorts of embedded information in the way it plays in your head that your students may or may not understand when they read that themselves. So using a closed question, and I'll show you some examples of my own work, is really helpful in this case. So I've used some terms that I haven't defined before, and I'll try and clarify that now. We talk about the stem of a multiple choice question. That's the body of the question, the part that would be, say, before that punctuation. And that stem should be really aligned with your hope in testing your students for some skill, some capacity they've acquired conceptually during your class. That might be a learning goal that you've specified for a given section. It might be a bigger learning goal for a module. It might be part of the entire course goal that you're testing on the final exam. But if you know that by the end of the course, I want to have a student develop competency, then you can begin to say, how can I ask a question that directly focuses on that competency, right? We talked earlier about an example in art class. If you were distinguishing between different periods or different artists, that's a higher ordered skill. You have to interpret a piece of art and then go back to some of the foundational time periods or influences or artists, repetitive sorts of things. I happen to be a bioscientist, so a lot of my students are learning microbiology. You'll see some examples of my questions in a moment. I don't expect you all to be microbiologists. Thankfully, we're a diverse group. But I try and embed my course with some big goals that have sub-goals, that have session objectives. And I can go back to those and say, well, how would I discriminate whether a student learned this concept effectively? And that hopefully will also influence the way you create these plausible distractors. So for example, if there's a concept, if there's a list of different things that I want you to be able to sort, then you could design a question that effectively asks students to sort things into certain categories based on what they've learned in the class. And as you'll see, the idea would be to try and move to higher ordered processes where students are doing more complex things rather than simply recalling what was said during class. But you may find that your overall exam is best balanced with some recall level, lower level learning, as well as some more complex integrative kinds of questioning. So in this particular case, the best practice is to write that stem. You create a question based on your learning goals, and you know as an expert the right answer. So go ahead and write that correct answer as your first option. And now the question is, how do you write those plausible distractors, those false answers that are not so false as to be clear whether you know that concept or not? And again, that helps you, A, sort of prime the pump, but B, ask the question, what are the other things that I want students to be able to do in terms of my goals in this class? How can they, I've used the term discriminate, or how can you find a way to keep this concept separate from another concept? If you're teaching math, do they have a sense of solving a problem a certain way? If you're in an educational environment where you're teaching a teaching and learning class, maybe you want to have students think differently about educational strategies, and you set up a STEM that has a clear best answer based on what you've taught them, and you could show them some of their other options that you've discussed in class that really don't apply to fixing this problem or solving this educational design problem. I'm acting as if I'm an expert in your field, and I don't mean to do that, but that's that's what we're talking about. And is that, am I being too simplistic for what you need? Yeah. One of the,
to me, it's really helpful just to think about.
I'm going to walk closely to you so you can be heard. or we'll hand you the microphone,
It's
Rebecca.
helpful to think about sort of writing out the correct answer first, and then working from that to, okay, what have we discussed that isn't correct and we decided wasn't correct, or, what would be a sort of typical mistake people would make, but having an organization and structure to the way you write every question, I think, is helpful.
Right. You could imagine a learning objective where you want students to understand the rules or confines of a certain system. As they solve a problem, they should think about this. This is their top priority, second priority, third priority. And then, maybe you talked about some other material around the same time. I've got students who seem to think that learning involves memorizing what I said, and that's a sort of learning, but it really doesn't help equip them with that information. So sometimes my plausible distractors are other things on the next slide or other things in order that aren't related to the stem of the problem, but were covered on the same day. So if a student doesn't really understand how to solve the problem, they're just memorizing a script, then they'll remember they were kind of close together physically or temporally, but they're not close together conceptually. And that would be a trap that students who are doing surface learning and superficial binge learning might fall into. And that might be useful to you. Again, my students call me Mixter the trickster. That's what my test questions do to them. So now YouTube and everyone else will use that term for me as well. So, yeah.
I prefer that.
Okay, fair enough. Any online questions, Theron? I'll pause there if there's anything. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the poker face aspect of this. You want to have your questions test your students' ability to use this new competency, but you don't want your students to recognize a false distractor easily without using the knowledge they've gained, right? So there are a couple of things. Make sure that the correct answer is not significantly different than the others. If your correct answer has a bunch of subclauses and the others are 2 or 3 words long, it's going to stick out just because it's longer. And students will pick it because the instructor must have thought that all those things were really important, and therefore I think this answer is important. The correct answer, again, has to fit the stem grammatically. If you're creating plausible distractors, you want to use the same verb tense and the same ing if that's what all the other options are showing. In some cases, you can be intentional about creating 5 options that each have different grammatic constructions. But you don't want the right one to be the only one that is not like the others, okay? Again, using my Sesame Street. It sounds funny, but naturally, human nature is to drop those things in the middle, drop the correct answer in the middle, and there are a lot of students who tell me, if I don't know, I'm going with C. It's, on average, it's always C. So again, if you're randomizing your answers, you're alphabetizing them, or you're using some way to make sure that you don't follow a pattern that your students can pick up on. Because what's going to happen is then a student who picks C, because you always pick C, is going to get it right, even though they don't have the competency or knowledge that you're striving for. So the test's ability to discriminate overall between students who know something and students who don't will be lost, and we don't want that, okay? And as I mentioned with sort of my subtitle, the correct answer is never the one with strong terms like always or all, okay? And I violated that when we talked about all of the above, but again, those strong terms are very restrictive, and students know that they rarely apply universally. That you've talked in your class about how things work and this rule that has an exception. So therefore, they can eliminate something that says that this always happens or this never happens. And students are savvy about that. Okay. Any other thoughts around the room here? Are those rules, those aren't hard rules to follow. Again, they're good to remind you in this particular case. All right, so we just talked about all of the above, none of the above. I will add that it's best to avoid questions that are set up in a negative way. Which of the following is not an example of? Is a bad sort of construct. All of the following are except. Those again aren't generally as useful. So you can usually flip those things in your construction to make them positive. Which of the following is an example of, and create some plausible distractors in that list. All right. So finally, I mentioned that ideally recall level or lower level questions have a testing value. Depending on how you structure your class, you might see recall level or lower level learning as C-level work. You're going to pass the class if you know the definitions, if you have some fundamental concepts. But as you discriminate passing versus excellence in the B and A category, you want students who do integrative work, can solve more difficult problems, and so you can create higher ordered questions that maybe ask students to incorporate multiple concepts from multiple days of instruction into an integrated, more complex problem. You might set up a question with a case which asks them to interpret a number of things and come up with a best option, right? You might have students interpret a graph or do something that asks them to speculate. Given this information and what you've learned in class, what would be the outcome you'd predict? A prediction is an expert level thing because it usually involves weighing different kinds of concepts and multiple things. So again, in the broader spectrum of the entire exam, you may include some lower level questions, recall level questions. What is the name of? When did this happen? And you might couple it with, during the Franco-Prussian conflict, why were these things important or something like that. I don't know much about the Franco-Prussian conflict, but that was just what I came up with. All right. So as we move on, you craft an exam, you put together stems, correct answers, and plausible distractors, and most of the time, at least in my experience, in my head, it's a really good exam. Okay. First thing, I would always encourage you to share it with a colleague. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the future. But you administer the exam after having an opportunity for other people to see it, give you some feedback, eliminate the typographical errors, eliminate the things that seem clear to you but not to someone else. Then you have the ability, in most cases, if you're using a test on Blackboard, you can run the item analysis. If you're using an optical scanning system like Scantron or others, you can get information about the individual test question performance. And again, item analysis here is asking about this question as one item in the aggregate of your entire exam. And as you'll see, it'll give you some data about how students performed on that question as an item, but it will also give you additional statistics about students who performed well on every item. How did they perform on this item? And we're going to walk through that in just a minute. This really gives you a reflective moment to ask, was this a good question? Did it do what I wanted it to do? And again, we'll get into some of the nuts and bolts on the statistics here, and we'll go from some easy statistics to maybe some more complicated things. If you're interested, there's a link, there's a web address for a recent publication. This is out of the medical education literature, but sort of a primer or how to get started on item analysis. And I think Christy set up a link to that particular recent open source publication as well. So what this is going to help you do is know how well that individual question you crafted looks in the bigger picture. So this is what item analysis tends to look like. And again, I know this is a busy slide, but we basically have 3 questions here. And I will tell you this is data from an exam I gave last summer. And I give some multiple choice coupled with some short answer responses. So what you get is question 12, let's say, has 5 choices, A through E. That's the construct I use. And there's a couple of columns here, upper quarter, lower quarter, total, and total percent and discrimination index from left to right on the screen. So we'll talk about upper quarter, lower quarter in a moment, but the total count tells you that in my case, out of the 14 students who were taking my summer class, 79% of them, that's 11 out of 14, chose A, which was the correct answer. And that meant that a vast majority of the students got that question right. So the difficulty factor is the same as that total percentage. The difficulty factor here is 0.786 or rounded to 79%. That's sort of the same thing. And again, the discrimination index gives you a sense of plus minus, how well is it discriminating from the whole. So there were a number of students who picked some other options, and in that case it was one of each. But what you see is students who performed in the upper quartile of the entire test. That means that out of those 15 students, they were in the upper 4 or 3 or 4. They generally got this question right? 3 of them did. In the lower 3, 3 of them also got that right. So the argument is that students on this item, out of all the items on the test, I think this test had 30 questions or maybe more, there was no difference in the students who did well on the test overall versus the students who did poorly on the test overall. All right. So again, I'm following best practices, but I wrote a question that almost 8 out of 10 students got right, yet it really didn't help me discriminate based on the other 29 items in the test between those students who knew a lot on the bulk of the questions and those students who didn't seem to perform well on the aggregate. So the discrimination value here is 0. It was not very helpful. And again, the B answer shows that the one student who picked it was actually a high performer. So you get a positive value there, even though it's the wrong answer. And a student who picked D as an option, you see that that has a negative discrimination index. It selects for students who are performing poorly overall. Any questions about that concept and some of the item analysis? Let's look at another example here. Question 13, lucky 13. It has a difficulty factor of 0.5. That means only half of the students who took the test got it right. But what you see is that of the students who picked it, there were 7. 4 of those 7 were in the upper quartile, and 0 of those students were in the lower quartile. So only the students, in this case, the discrimination index is much better, right? Even though the class performance on the test question is poorer. And again, different instructors have a different target in terms of the percentage. I know some statisticians who like to hit 70%, arguing that a student who can get 70% of the questions right times 30 questions, that's their target. In medical school or professional programs, you might want that number to be bigger. You might want to see the class is generally going to perform better overall. This isn't a random assortment of students at varying competencies. So you might want to average 80%. But again, we're looking at performance, but we're also looking at discrimination at the same time, okay? And again, in this case, the students who didn't pick the right answer tended to be in this question, tended to be the students who were doing poorly on the rest of the exam, arguing that this question really did help separate those students who had a good overall competency from those students who were just guessing. All right. I hope that's clear. Again, I think I can show you something maybe I'm not proud of, which is question 14, which again had some discrimination, but it looks like a lot of students are all over the map, and a number of students bid on an incorrect answer, but the overall performance was 36%, and I'm not sure that I'm sorry, my mistake. The overall performance was 50%, but a lot of students bid on that A option, almost a third of those taking the exam. So I might use that question for two ways. One, I might look and see whether the question was discriminating students the way I wanted it to, and two, whether my instruction during the class really equips students to decide and correctly discriminate the right A through E option. Because this data is a little tricky in that it doesn't really tell you, what was happening in that regard. Was it the instruction that could change to improve the performance, or was it the question's ability? I might look at that A option to see why students are misinterpreting it, including some students who are good performers overall. So I've gone through item analysis quickly, and with some intention, we could talk about some more statistics, but I wonder if any of you in the room have questions, or anyone online has some questions that we could talk about. Christy asks where this came from. For me, it was Scantron. I use optical scanning. Students fill out that bubble sheet. But in Blackboard, once you've made an assessment, there's an item analysis once the assessment is closed. And you essentially run a report, and you can get the same kind of data in Blackboard.
Does it do the upper quarter, lower quarter? Does it have the same data?
I believe it's actually I've done that less than I've done Scantron, but I believe Blackboard can give you the same outputs.
Thank you.
I don't know if other people in the room have some insights there, but if I remember correctly, there's also some ways in Blackboard to drill down a little deeper. You can do some more complicated statistics if you wish.
Phil, Lori says she uses a Kindi to grade.
A Kindi is a Scantron-like system. That way you can send off PDFs and they scan them, and hopefully they return some statistics.
Yeah, she says it returns a discriminability score, a DS score. She's done two versions of the test, same questions, different order. DS of questions differ based upon which version of the student took.
Okay.
She says, what does that mean, that two versions of the test is not good practice? It's led her to discount the DS results.
Okay. Thanks, Lori, for that question. When you give questions in order, my assumption about your testing, Lori, is that the tests are exactly the same, but they're scrambled, essentially to create an environment where wandering eyes can't learn something from their neighbor. And that's a very common practice. What I've found personally is that a student who encounters a certain earlier question may be thinking about that question when they look at the next question, and that may influence their choices. Again, if they made a wrong turn earlier, it may splash over into a subsequent question. Ideally, again, each of these items would have their own intrinsic value of discrimination, and you wouldn't think that the suggestion put in by question 3 would influence question 5. But students, while taking an assessment, absolutely are influenced by the order as well. So one of the ways you can take the data you have, which is that simply changing the order changes the discrimination ability, now you have to be aware of the order and this idea that a test question or an item has the ability to suggest an answer later. And again, I have students who will write something in my fill-in that is absolutely based on a multiple choice question that they thought was right, and in fact, their fill-in verbal answer is about one of those plausible distractors. So I've suggested something, and because they don't have a good conceptual framework to work, I've pushed them out of what they might know into something that's absolutely false. So I think that same thing can happen question to question.
She jumped in as you were speaking. She said, yes, the tests are identical except for question order.
Okay. Again, in an ideal situation, you're thinking as an expert that the ordering of the options as well as the ordering of the individual items, the test questions, shouldn't matter, but you have data that now you know it does, and that might force you to maybe create sections within the test to try and separate a concept from another. Or you might go back in reflecting on your instruction and tell students that this is what you've observed in the past to help them try and separate those concepts as they learn this topic for the first time as novices. And I don't have a lot of other insights, but maybe our larger community of practice may have some insight as well. Anyone have any other suggestions to offer?
Lori had one more comment. She said, average on the two versions is usually nearly identical with 2 points or so usually, so it doesn't appear to affect exam outcome.
That's interesting. So it doesn't affect the overall outcome, but for certain items, there's an influence. The good news is that would argue the exam as a whole is working if students are performing at equal levels and the only change is the order. But because of the items you're talking about, you recognize that order matters in the case of those items. You might consider having a conversation with a student or 5 about what their thinking was and why, if you could identify them reflectively from this particular case, try and understand their thinking. And that might take an interview more than item analysis. That's a little harder to do. Okay. Thanks, Lori. I really appreciate your engagement, and that's a great question at this stage. So in summary, for this part, I just want to remind you that we want folks to do a good job of giving tests that's well designed, but this is a cycle. And if you're not reflecting on how well the assessment performed, you're not completing the cycle. So we want you to use item analysis or some sort of reflection about my intentions were to have this test do certain things. This kind of data can give you the information about whether it did that effectively or not. And again, the best practice here is to continue to cycle. If you identify a test question that didn't work very well, you need to tweak it. You need to tune it up, or you need to toss it and think about using a different approach to test on that concept. And that's hard, but I know when I get a test question that just a small amount of the class gets right, and maybe it doesn't discriminate very well, I'm like, well, that's probably not a very good question. It's probably not discriminating the way I want to. And the students who got it right for the wrong reasons. They got it right because they happened to fill out the right bubble, not because I was such a great teacher or something like that. So that's my being a great teacher is rarely the reason students get things right. So he said with some sarcasm. So let's take another break to pair and share. I've been talking for too long, and I just want to let people sort of take a breath. And here in Pullman, we'll maybe talk about some of the best practices. If there's something we haven't talked about or ways you employ those best practices I have talked about, let's take a couple moments and share about that. So I'll mute my own mic, and if you're online, stick with us. We're coming right back in 2 minutes. All right, we're going to come back. We were in Pullman. We were having a conversation about some of the all of the above, none of the above options, as well as some variations where you create a multiple choice rather than picking the single best answer. You'd select all that apply. And again, different software is going to allow you to do those things. We're a little less clear about Blackboard, but I think Aquindi, the one mentioned from the WSU Tri-Cities campus, does give you that option of having, in a single test group, you can essentially fill in multiple options. So those are some great best practices to share. So I want to show you that I do my best to write good questions. And again, these are all microbiology questions from my area of expertise. But in this particular case, my test questions are just here as examples. So I had my students learn about different ways you can get Bacillus anthracis infection, which is the microbe that causes anthrax. And anthrax kills people pretty effectively, but it depends on how you get it, right? So these are actually a number of the symptoms associated with anthrax. You can get Cardinal's cap, you can get an Eschar lesion, both from anthrax. Cardinal's cap is inhaled, and that's the correct answer here. Eschar lesion would be a cutaneous anthrax infection. But some of these other things are designed to be plausible distractors. Again, not to test your ability about anthrax, but let's talk about them. I alphabetize all of my responses, and in my other version, they're reverse alphabet. So they're Z to A as opposed to A to Z. So they always have the same options in my versions, but I try and scramble them as we discussed before. All right. All of these are seemingly plausible conditions, right? There isn't an option that says blue color compared to, symptomology, which was the stem of my question. There are some diseases that are unrelated to anthrax, but you can ingest anthrax, you can eat anthrax, and it will liquefy your intestines. That's different than diarrhea. Right? So that was my plausible distractor. I'm sorry if this is not things you want to talk about, but science is messy, okay? And then I created a long option that was wrong. So blocked airway syndrome sounds good, right? If you got it in your lungs and it was inhaled, I was trying to think of something that would include some words that seemed plausible, like you inhale it, so it must be an airway problem, okay? And again, maybe I'm being tricky by creating that as the long option. So I'm working against the best practices to try and have my students use their knowledge rather than just pick the long one, okay? What's interesting, again, is that Cardinal's cap, I won't tell you more about where that comes from, but that doesn't seem like it fits with inhaling anthrax. And so if you don't remember that lesson or you don't remember that content about this particular disease, it's hard to pick out of the list. If you were an English major, that might not be the one you would pick, assuming you'd never taken my microbiology class. Any thoughts about what's on the board as an example here? Because I'm willing to share, and I'd love to hear your feedback if you have questions or concerns. All right, I know this isn't micro class, but I'll just throw another option out here. My summer test question included, this is sort of a medium, it's not quite a lower level question, but it's not quite a higher level question. So this is a certain kind of virus. And on 1 week, we talked about how to classify them. That classification is based on the configuration of their genetic material. But later, we talked about how they get into cells. So what I did was I fused 1 week's lecture with another week's lecture and combined them into the same question. And again, got to the point where I gave them an option, E, where more than one of the above might be true for this particular virus. This asks students to manage information from one section of the course and another section of the course. And the thing that holds them together is we talked about the same virus in terms of its infectivity as well as its classification. So I created a higher level or a little bit higher level than recall question by just simply using related information based on the STEM. Okay? And again, I tried to kind of reverse alphabetize. I tried to alphabetize the answers, and then I had the E and my context where I logically say only B and C above are correct. That's the language I tend to use for those more than one of the above are correct answers. Okay. Questions about that construct? Thoughts? All right, you're still worried about anthrax, I know. So, okay. With apologies to Oprah, you get a STEM, and you get a STEM, and you get a plausible distractor. In this particular case, socializing your test writing is really always a best practice. So that embeds a couple of things. One, you've got to prepare that exam in advance. Give your colleagues some time to read it, get back to you, give you some feedback, and make changes before the exam is due. I think most humans are deadline driven. I'm certainly one of those. And that means that the best work is done well in advance. You can finish a module in your course, write some questions, and give those to a colleague, and then assemble them later. But I always worry about editing errors. I always worry about things my students will pick up on that are not intended. So I really encourage you to use your colleagues to get feedback in this particular process. We were going to have more discussion now about how we can apply some of these best practices, and maybe what we'll do is include that discussion in our short break. And my hope is that we'd come back and actually work on questions. And if folks who are listening in the live stream online want to try and type some questions into the comments section, maybe we can work on getting them in front of the whole group. But my hope is that we'll have a little break now, talk a little bit about how you can change your practice and improve your test writing abilities. Thanks. I'm so sorry. I managed to not put it in my pocket. So what I've got on the screen is just sort of the summary slide to remind you of some things we've covered today. We had a great discussion about a big box class with 800 students, many of whom are less used to using the multiple choice format, and talking about an instructor who's providing some authentic practice. And that's something to consider as well. Students may or may not be used to a multiple choice format. Your syntax in creating these questions is something they have to learn. Do they have some practice questions available online? Is there an old exam available to them in their social group? Or do you make it available on Blackboard to everyone as an archive file to give them the chance to do some practice prior to the big test day? A question online, Darren?
Yeah, Lori has a suggestion about a best practice. One thing she does is she writes 2 to 3 multiple choice questions immediately following the class. She finds it's easier to include the questions or misunderstandings that students had during the class when she does it right away.
That's a terrific suggestion. Thank you again, Lori. Writing a few questions about class content right after class as you go back to your office or wherever will help you tailor those questions to what actually happened in class more effectively than if you reflect on them 2 weeks later, because we all have trouble capturing that. And then having a pool of questions that you can draw from when it comes time to put together your exam. Again, slow and steady wins the race. I tell my students you wouldn't want to study like you would train for a marathon. You don't train for a marathon by running for 72 hours straight before the start of the race, right? That's a terrible strategy. So in test writing, slow and steady gives you some reflective time to look at that question you wrote yesterday and think, oh, I want to tweak that, or, you know, that didn't cover the material the way I wanted to cover it. It gives you the opportunity in that reflective mode to improve your assessment and have that assessment tool really discriminate students. I'm going to ask you to use the microphone.
And I'm just curious, do you give them that same advice about studying? Because that's a great analogy.
I do. That's the analogy I use. You know, the brain is actually a muscle, so you need to use a weight training mentality. You don't get into shape by going to the gym for a marathon session. You just get sore. So that's maybe what happens to me. I don't know about anyone else, but
Perfect.
yeah, yeah. And again, if you were paying a trainer or an instructor to gain some skill and competency, if you were paying a piano teacher, you'd have lessons every week, and that would be a lot better than 6 lessons on a Saturday. So, yeah. Okay, so in this summary, we've gotten some best practices in front of you and some good resources. I hope those are available to you. Check out those links. We want you to do this together. If you're team teaching a course, as one of our participants is here, it's a cluster of instructors who are covering the same material. If you have the ability for an added value, there are another layer, which is to use some common test elements, and then you can begin to test across sections or across semesters or other ways to give you more reflective information about how well a test item is working. In the cycle, you're going to construct, apply, analyze, and repeat. Again, wash, rinse, and repeat, and just go around and around. And pretty soon, you're going to have a pool of a lot of test questions. Sometimes professors ask me, well, do you give your test back? Do you publish your test questions? I personally have so many tests available to my students, probably, I don't know, a number of semesters. I teach this class a lot. And there are so many ways to practice that if they memorize those questions or practice that way, they will have met my learning objectives. They will use that as authentic practice. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll take an old test question and I'll modify it in a way to make the old answer wrong. So if they've just memorized the test question, they fall into that trap, is one way to think about it. Because they don't understand the concept or they're not reading the question, they're just understanding that this was on the 2016 exam, and that's not my learning goal. So again, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap this session up, but if you have questions, I want to encourage you to continue to collaborate, work with your colleagues in this process, and make sure that as you work with others, feel free to contact me, feel free to contact the Learning Innovation folks who are here as well. And our contact information is up here. I'm P. Mixter at WSU, and of course, the AOI.li folks want to hear your questions and look forward to working with you. So thanks again for taking the time. I really want to encourage you to take it slow and steady and continue to cycle, work with your colleagues to get feedback and move forward. You'll get better at this.
Great, thanks, Phil.
Thank you.
This has been excellent, and this is our last faculty-led workshop of the academic year. So, and thanks to Christy and the media team and Theron, everyone that helps support these. And we'll be back next year. We're going back to noon with food.
Excellent. Thank you.